So here's a toolkit. I've got a hammerstone, I've got a piece of antler, and I've got a pressure flaker. I've got several different pressure flakers. And then I have a piece of leather, and I also have a piece of leather for my hand. So here's one of those flakes right here. And what it will have is what's called the platform. That's where it was struck. There's one face, this is the interior of the rock. This is called the ventral face. This is how it came off the stone. And it's very smooth. There was a very nice energy wave that carried through this, and it's flat. The other face, there are previous flake scars. This is called the dorsal face, and you will always have other flake scars on that dorsal face. These pieces of rock now, we have names for everything. As I said, we would refer to these as blanks. These are initial pieces of stone that I can work down into something that would make a usable tool for them. And these are the kinds of things that, if I didn't work on them necessarily today, I'd take away with me. Whether you use a piece of antler or a piece of wood, you would definitely have to switch to using a less dense material. Otherwise, this piece of stone would just shatter when I hit it next. And what I'm doing is I'm creating a surface on one face that I can then take flakes off on an opposing face. Taking flakes off on one face, that's unifacial flaking. Taking flakes off both faces, in which I'm producing a symmetrical edge, is bifacial flaking. And these unifaces are multi-purpose. They're sort of like the Swiss Army knife, in that they can be used for virtually anything, and they're somewhat easy to make if you've got a good piece of rock. Let's see. Here's the flake again. I've got my platform, I've got that flat face, and then I've got the dorsal face of the whole series of flakes that have come off of it. It's just a flake. I want to turn it into a tool, and I can do that in a number of ways. I'm just going to do this real quick. And I now have a uniface, in that I took flakes off of one edge. These are often referred to in Maine as end scrapers, in that the end opposite the platform is the one being modified for use as a tool. This is what we could refer to as an expedient tool. This is a tool in itself. It was made real quick. I can use it for the purpose at hand. But then it's so easy to make, I can toss it when I'm done, and you can find it, in the ground 2,000 years later. These are as I mentioned, the Swiss Army knives of the past. You can do any number of things. If you had a piece of raw skin here, you could use a tool like this and scrape the hair off of it, or the inside, all the fat that's still adhering to the skin. And you'll leave a series of marks on this material. You see there's a uniformity in patterning. I started and just moved it over. So whatever I'm doing, I'm removing the material consistently across a face, okay, with a rounded edge. If I have a stick, I'm going to make this into an arrow. One of the things I want to do is remove all the bark from it, so that I have a consistently smooth surface that will be aerodynamically sound. I can use this to scrape this. With the piece of antler, suppose I want to turn this into a harpoon of some sort, or some other kind of tool. I might want to thin the surface down. There are lots of different techniques, but I'm just going to show you. If I'm modifying this with this, again, like the hide, it will take off a certain amount of material. And we could stain this with like India ink or something simple, anything that would give it a color, and look at it under a binocular microscope at low power, and then put one of your bone tools you found right beside it, and you would see that the marks on that bone tool are replicated in the same manner that they are in this piece of antler I just demonstrated. So again, by experimentation, by analogy, if I can make the same marks on a piece of bone today with a scraping tool, and you find these scraping tools in the archaeological site, and you find tools with similar marks, is it safe for us to say that's how these things were produced? And the answer is, it's safe for us to conclude that's one way they were produced. It may not be the only way, but by replication then, we do come up with some good understanding of the archaeological record. Through repeated pressure against that stone, I could begin to produce a little notch in this through use. And we really couldn't figure out why all these things have these little notches in them. The notches are very narrow. If I were scraping a stick again, sometimes you find them with very broad notches. We refer to these as spoke shaves. And it fits around the edge of the, and you can take off a whole bunch of material at once. These were about 3 millimeters, very narrow across and deep. And we have said no bone on the site. Bone won't preserve there. We're on the edge of the Niagara River watching sturgeon and pike and all kinds of other big fish out there. What were they hunting them with? And what we found is that kind of a tool edge, and I had some bone, but it was getting kind of rotten, so I didn't bring it. Pressed against the wall of a bone, the cross section of a bone wall, like that of a deer, fit very nicely into that groove, and you could very quickly produce a nice rounded edge to that piece of bone if you had a splinter of bone and you were making it into a harpoon. So our conclusion is that in fact those narrowly notched flakes that we were finding that were utilized were likely being used to modify the edge of a piece of bone for making bone harpoons. So arguably you could say that in terms of investment of labor and costs, that women could have been more suited to make these stone tools than our men. But it's not the kind of thing we're ever going to know. I always thought women made the pots until this guy named Bill Longacre went off to the Philippines and saw that men were always making the pots. So that's a unifacial flake tool. I showed you I made a blank here, and I told you how we'd go about setting up an edge to produce a biface, and that one's right here. Now, having produced this edge, sort of as I did with that scraping tool that's being passed around, I've got flakes off one face here. Now I've got a whole other set of problems. I know I can't hit it with a piece of stone. I've got too much energy going into it. I know I've got all new set of angle relationships with this face, and I know I've got a very delicate edge right there that I need to be able to generate energy into without crushing it, having it collapse, so that I get a wave that goes in and I take off a flake in a predictable manner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grind that edge. And by grind, I'll just hold it. You see, it looks a little whiter along. I don't know if you can see that from there. But the reason I did that is twofold. The first is I needed to reduce that edge a bit, bring it back in, so that when I hit it, it just doesn't break because it's too brittle. The other thing is, this stone is fairly slick, and if I hit it, my tool, my piece of antler is going to slide a bit. At this point, in producing a bifacially flaked edge, you have to have really ultimate control over this piece of stone in knowing that where you hit it, it's going to stay, and you're going to be able to knock that flake off. If you don't have that kind of control over it, you're not going to be able to make a spear point or an arrow point. It just cannot happen. And so with this piece of stone then, I've prepared that edge. I can now take my hammerstone and along it take another series of flakes. I know that whoever was working here, if you were to find these in the ground, were already in the process of thinning a biface edge from finding a flake like this one. And that's because the platform has been ground. And you will find these grind platforms all over this site and any site where stone tool working has been an activity. A ground platform has characteristics that are different than those first flakes that are taken off, where you're not so concerned about control as you are just getting a piece of material that you can work on. And so in a site like this, if all you had were ground platforms and no other kind of platform being discovered, one of the conclusions that would be reasonable is that people didn't arrive on the site with big raw chunks of material. They arrived with things that were already in production. You know, they brought things sort of semi-made so they can finish them off and use them on this site, rather than use this site as a location where initial production and all stages of production occur. And when you start looking around, you know, you will find sites in Maine where one or the other, and also both kinds of activities, early stage, late stage, and all stages of reduction occur. But these little flakes, and the reason you're collecting them, you know, is because they are as important as are those arrowheads for giving you information about what people were doing in the past. This edge, I'll just pass this around and you'll see a bifacial edge just like you've seen on the arrow points that you've been discovering in the ground and the broken pieces of arrow points. It's now bilaterally symmetrical with flakes on either side. So what I wanted to get across to you then is archaeologists approached this record that you're working so meticulously to uncover with, you know, all different kinds of tools. Tools they learned in school, tools they learned on their own, different ways of looking at things. There are some things that we can be more sure of than others, and that is, in order to break a piece of stone, you have to do these certain things. In order to understand the archaeological record, you have to be creative. You have to be mindful that someone may come along with other ideas that are better than yours, and you have to realize that whatever you find this year and interpret, you know, if you come back to the site, you may come up with some different conclusions about what was going on. The reason to study flakes and to learn about how these things were made is to gain an appreciation in that people, although they did not have brick buildings in which they went to school, they were certainly very intimately knowledgeable about their environment. They understood it completely, no differently than the way you and I know how to navigate our way through Walmart. They knew what they were doing with their environment. And as a result, the more we study these sorts of things through experimentation and stuff, the more we gain an appreciation for just how complex were some of the things that they were doing in the past, even though they may quote-unquote look primitive to us in the 21st century. And that for me, the way to learn about the past oftentimes has been through like experimenting. It's like kids like to play in a sandbox. I like to play in a sandbox and try to figure out what was done. So thank you.
Thank you.